Welcome back. This is the second lecture in Module 4 on measuring departmental productivity and the direct costs of delivering instruction. In Part 1, we looked at productivity measures. In Part 2, we're looking at cost measures for instruction. So we'll drill down into what are instructional costs. In this series of lectures, we're talking about the key measures of productivity, the measurement of instructional costs, the key metrics of instructional costs, or the key ratios of those. In the third lecture, we'll come back to what are the key conclusions about instructional costs from the Delaware study. In the second lecture, the one we're in right now, we will stay focused on instructional costs and ratios of productivity to costs. When we talk about instructional costs, we can, again, categorize total costs into compartmental domains. There are two primary ways that we can think about instructional costs: direct cost of instruction and indirect cost of instruction. Direct costs are what you would think about when you think about what does it cost to have a course taught. Direct costs are how much you're paying the faculty member to be in the class to teach. Those are personnel costs. And when we think about personnel costs, we've got to think not just about what is the salary that person is making, but also what does it cost the university to pay for benefits for that faculty member as well. So the direct cost of instruction involves personnel costs. Personnel costs are divided into salary costs and benefit costs. Other direct costs associated with teaching a course come from the departmental budget. The departmental budget pays for the materials that may be used in a course. They pay for the copying costs to provide handouts to students if they're used. They provide other kinds of support structures for the faculty member to actually be able to walk into the class well prepared to teach the class. When we think about the direct cost of instruction, we're thinking not just about what does it take to pay a person to be in that class, but also how much budget is in that department. If we divided the department budget across all the courses, how much of the department budget would go to support this course? We can also think about indirect costs, and indirect costs are anything that isn't the direct cost for a department to have a budget and for you to pay a faculty member to be in front of a class. It is all the administration at a college or university. It's the library costs, it's the registrar costs, it's the student life co-curricular costs, it's whatever the heating in the building costs, it's the recruitment costs to get students in the classroom, it's the advertising costs, the classroom technology costs, etc. The indirect costs of instruction are huge. In some cases, they're half of the cost. Sometimes they're 60% of the cost. When we're talking about instructional costs in productivity studies, we don't actually measure or calculate those indirect costs. So when we're talking about productivity studies and direct instructional cost, we don't pay attention really to half of the cost of getting a course taught. We're paying attention to just what is the marginal cost of that professor in that course to teach those students. It's important, therefore, to have this sense that we're really only measuring part of the story here. We're not paying attention to the president's salary, my salary, any student life salary, etc., that actually really does help with education, but it doesn't help with the direct product of delivering education to these students in these courses. Now, we'll go into some detail on how we find instructional costs. And just like in the first lecture for the fourth module, when I talked about specific measures of productivity, we're going to talk about specific ways of calculating direct instructional cost. There's 4 parts to this. The first thing you do is find out how much faculty get paid. And by pay, we mean both salary and benefit costs. Second, we're going to compute the percentage of pay that actually goes to teaching as opposed to doing administrative or other kinds of work. So first, find out how much is the total compensation. Second, find out what percentage of that compensation goes to actually teaching. Third, find out what other costs a program has to provide education to the student. That is, look at the department budget. and specifically we're talking about the department expense budget. And then fourth, we're going to add the results of what we find for teaching compensation and departmental costs to get to instructional costs. So we're going to say that direct instructional cost is a sum of instructional salary and benefits plus program expense budgets. So let me lead you through those 4 steps. First, you find out how much faculty get paid. We're going to pretend that we've got a very small department with 3 faculty members in it. And in this small department, faculty member A gets paid $65,000, faculty member B gets paid $75,000, and faculty member C, been there a longer time, gets paid $90,000. So the total salary in the department is $230,000. The benefits are pretty hefty. Usually that's because you've got benefits associated with health care, benefits associated with retirement. There's often some life insurance or other kinds of insurance that gets paid for, and additional benefits that might include tuition benefits. So those get allotted to the faculty member. Usually that's a simple percentage, like 30% or 40% of the salary. And you can see in this case, the benefits are $92,000. So the total compensation for all assignments for those 3 faculty members is the sum of salary and benefits across all 3 people, or $322,000 for those 3 faculty. This is very typical. As a rule of thumb, I expect that a full-time faculty member in a department will cost at least $100,000 a year. That's just a standard rule of thumb at this point in history. In a state university, it's probably more. In a small private, it's probably a little bit less than what Bethel pays, but here it would be starting at around $100,000 per faculty member. Second, you then look at how much load is actually assigned to teaching. So we look not only at salary and benefits that a faculty member gets paid, you also look at their load credits and the assignments that they have load credit for. So if we look at faculty member A, that person had 24 load credits assigned to her for the year, and she taught exclusively. She had no administrative assignment. She didn't get load credit for anything other than teaching. So how much of her load credit was for teaching? 100% of it. So the proportion spent teaching was 1.0 or 100%. For faculty member B, that person had 23 and a half load credits for the year. 22 load credits were in teaching assignments, and therefore faculty member B had 90% of his time spent teaching, or the proportion of teaching was 0.9 of the total load credit, 90% teaching. Then for faculty member C, we see that the faculty member had 24 load credits total assigned to her, but 18 of that was for teaching. The other 6 was for what? Right, administrative assignments. And so faculty member C, probably the department chair, is in teaching assignments 80% of the time. If we add up all the load credits for all 3 faculty, there were approximately 72 load credits for the department. 64 of those were for teaching assignments. And so for the department, about 90% of the faculty work was in teaching. And then we can take that 90% and calculate what is the instructional cost for salary and benefits in that department. For faculty member 1, 100% of the cost is in teaching, so the full salary and benefits is the instructional cost. For faculty member B, 90% of their assignment was for teaching or instruction, and so we take 0.9 times $105,000, that's the compensation for faculty member B, and we see that the instructional cost for faculty member B is about $98,000. And for faculty C, we multiply 0.8 times $126,000, and we see the instructional cost for that faculty member is $94,500. The total instructional cost is $283,798 for that department. So how much does it cost to deliver instruction for this made-up department? Not $300,000, a little bit less than $300,000, but we know exactly what it costs to provide salary and benefits for those 3 faculty members to teach the courses they taught that year. Instructional wages is salary plus benefits. We look specifically, when we're talking about instructional costs, only at load credit for teaching assignments, and we modify salary and benefits by taking the proportion of total load credits spent in teaching and multiplying that proportion times total compensation for a faculty member, and that gives us instructional compensation or instructional wages. Complicated, I know, but one of the points I want to make is we can get really precise in how much it costs to deliver academic instruction to students. Once we know the salary and benefits that go to instruction, we also then need to know what are the expense budgets for the department to provide instruction. Let's say this department has a very modest departmental budget of $35,000. We can now say that the total instructional cost for that department for a year is the instructional wages, $283,798, plus the program expense budget of $35,000, and we can then conclude pretty precisely that the instructional cost for that academic department for a year was $318,798. That number probably doesn't mean a lot, except it should tell you we've got a precise measure of what it costs to actually provide teachers in a classroom for a year. We don't usually pay a lot of attention to this raw number that I just described, the instructional cost. It's usually not the main statistic that gets reported, although it can be helpful. More importantly and more interestingly, we can look at ratios of academic productivity or instructional productivity to instructional costs. And there are 2 key ratios that we can look at. The first is cost of instruction per full-time equivalent faculty member. And there we take instructional cost divided by FTE faculty. A second and more important ratio, however, is cost per student credit hour. So the cost of instruction per student credit hour. There you take the total instructional cost and you divide it by the total student credit hours sold for a program over a semester or a year or whatever your time unit is. So these two ratios are important: cost of instruction per full-time faculty member and cost of instruction per student credit hour. They are standard metrics that help you with planning. They are standard metrics that help you look at trends across time, and they are standard metrics that help you compare across programs. A couple examples, if we're looking at FTE faculty, so I want to remind you how we calculated FTE faculty. We took instructional load, and we can divide that by full-time load. So in a given department, a made-up department, there are 64 load credits for teaching, and full-time load in that department is 72 for 3 faculty members. And so there are 2.67 instructional faculty members in that department. 2.67 full-time equivalent instructional faculty members in that department. So even though there are 3 heads in that department, the instructional FTEs is less than 3. It's 2 2/3, 2.67. Then we can calculate the cost per full-time equivalent faculty member, the instructional cost per full-time equivalent faculty member. So we take the instructional cost total, $318,798, and we divide that by 2.67 FTE faculty. So we can say that the cost of providing a full-time equivalent faculty member in a classroom for a year on average is $119,549. Why would I want to know that? If I'm a dean, I want to know that because I want to know what it's going to cost for me to hire another faculty member. It's a pretty precise number, and I would use that number when I'm budgeting or making a budget request. When you have that precise of a number and you come to the budget table, people will know that you've done your homework, so it creates some trust for you. But it also helps you not underestimate the cost of instruction. By looking at this number and I'm taking into account departmental budget as well as instructional cost and the shrinkage associated with administrative cost, I can be pretty confident that at the budget table, I am not underestimating the cost that it's going to take to bring a new person into a department. I'm not going to be exactly right with that number, of course, but I am pretty confident that I'm going to be able to add both department expense budget money and faculty salary money to the budgets so that as a program grows, I'm not just adding people without adding expense budgets to the department. People cost. Every time you add a person, you need to also pay attention to adding costs to the expense budget in a department. And this ratio helps you plan, helps you think about the future. It also helps you monitor costs over time, but it helps you build credibility at a budget table so you're more likely to get the money because you have credibility. Let's also talk about cost per student credit hour. So we know what the instructional cost is. If we divide instructional cost by the total student credit hours for a program, we're going to get the cost per student credit hour to deliver that program. Let's say that there were 1,000 student credit hours sold for that department for that year. That means that the cost per student credit hour to teach is $319. $318,797 divided by 1,000 rounds out to $319 a credit. Why is that useful? For one thing, we charge tuition by credit. If I know that it costs $319 for direct expense to deliver instruction in that department, then I better set tuition at a lot higher number than that. I better set tuition at least twice that because I know that indirect instructional cost is going to be probably about 50% of total cost. So I'm probably not even going to break even in charging for a program if I'm not taking the cost per student credit hour and maybe doubling it or maybe more than doubling it in order to pay for all the operations associated with teaching. But I know for sure that I can plan on spending at least $319 out of every credit hour charged for the direct cost of instruction. So another thing I can do with this number is divide it by the tuition charge to say, here's the percentage that we're paying out of tuition for the direct cost of actually delivering an academic program. Here's what we pay from your tuition dollar to actually provide great faculty in the classroom to support your learning. So it's a nice metric because we can compare it to what we charge students. It's a nice metric because it can help us set what we charge to students. And it's also a nice metric because it's standardized across programs and it allows me to clearly compare programs within a university. We started out by talking about two types of costs, direct costs, indirect costs. When we talk about direct costs, we're talking about the cost of teaching. And when we talk about the cost of teaching, we're talking about personnel costs, and those always include both salary and benefit costs. And you'll find in some conversations that people forget to talk about benefits. You need to talk about those because they're often 30 to 40% of the total cost. When we're talking about direct costs, we also always talk about the expense budgets in a department because that helps provide the setting, the context for instruction. When we are doing this analysis, the most important statistic to come out of the analysis is the cost per student credit hour or the cost per credit to deliver the program. It's, again, a standardized number, allows you to compare across departments, compare across time, compare to tuition charges, and it is a useful number for talking in public because people kind of get, okay, that's what it really costs to have a teacher in the classroom to deliver great education. It's also the case that we do talk about cost per FTE faculty, and that's helpful not usually for public conversations, but it is helpful for budgeting and managing. As I said, these ratios help for accurate budgeting for hiring in a department. They're especially useful when evaluating a new program or for reducing or eliminating a program. So if you're in budget cutting territory, you can look at instructional cost and you can say, okay, if we cut faculty, this is likely what we'll be able to save. If you're growing and you're adding faculty, you can say, if we're adding, this is likely what it will cost us. And if you're planning a new program, you can take a similar kind of program and you can use the ratios and the cost data that you've looked at to help effectively plan for what it's going to take to actually develop this new program. It is also possible to look at data from other schools, and this study that we'll talk about in the next lecture, the Delaware study, allows you very effectively to do apples-to-apples comparisons across different universities. So we can look at what does it cost to deliver biology at Bethel versus biology at an average private college or university in the country. It's really nice when we look within a department to try to compare outside of one university and look at other universities. And the Delaware study actually has developed methodology that allows you to compare your program at one school to programs at other schools. Then you can figure out, are we paying too little? Are we paying too much? Is this something faculty have a right to be concerned about because we're underfunding them? Or is this data that shows that, in fact, we're paying a lot more for biology here than we're paying elsewhere? I haven't done that comparison at Bethel, just to be clear, but the Delaware study does allow for that, and it's a particularly valuable tool to compare across universities because you can then know if you're under or over funding. In this second lecture, we've talked about cost analysis, so how do you measure instructional costs? And we've talked about the uses of those costs, especially for the ratios that you calculate. And you've learned about the two most important ratios, cost per full-time equivalent faculty member and cost per student credit hour. You've now learned the basics of measuring academic productivity and instructional cost. These are essential concepts for academic deans, for academic budgeters, and they're helpful concepts for faculty because they help you know how to talk to deans and how to talk to provosts.